Experienced pigeon flyers know the best pigeons in the world are no good if they're not healthy. It's a waste of time if your healthcare falls down, and if the lofts are no good, it's a waste of money. In a moment, we'll be joining Tony Cowan to discuss diseases and their treatment with well-known pigeon vet David Palmer. But first, let's meet a flyer on his way up the ladder. George Satterley had an interest in pigeons since a boy, like most of us. Now, his wins are getting noticed, but like most successful fanciers, he believes it's how he keeps his pigeons and what he keeps them in that makes the difference. For George, a good, solid, dry loft is as important as the care and training that he gives his pigeons.
Well, I lived in flats when I was young, and over the wall from the flats, a fella kept pigeons, and I used to sit on the wall looking down at him. And after several weeks, he called me down, and that's how I really got involved. I had pigeons before I came here and packed up, and then when I came here, I decided to have another go, and this is how I come to buy a loft, and I've gone on from there and bought, bought several. I won the combine twice. Once from Bergerac, 2 pigeons in 1 thimble, first and second, and from Wren's. Won the combine. I've done very well across the channel, but saying that, since I've been here, I've done very well last year. I won the averages, and I've done better this year. I think I've won 7 or 8 races, and I know I've topped the Fed 3 times, so I'm quite pleased how they're coming, you know.
One reason behind George's success is the conditions his pigeons enjoy. He has well-built, dry, solid lofts, and that's important. As he'd say, the money's well spent. But there is something else, good medical care. So let's go over now to join Tony with David Palmer and hear what he has to say about that.
In the British Isles, veterinaries, cats and dogs, of course, are their forte. When it comes to racing pigeons, it's increasingly difficult to find somebody who understands the concepts of what we racing pigeon fanciers need. Today I've got David Palmer, an excellent veterinary. David, tell me, how did you become interested in pigeons?
Well, I've been in general practice in Dewsbury in West Yorkshire for approximately 22 years, and this practice had to deal with a wide variety of species of animals, both cats and dogs, horses, cattle, pigs, and of course racing pigeons. Now, West Yorkshire is an area that has a lot of racing pigeons, and consequently I was presented frequently with racing pigeons and their worried owners, and these people either brought a problem of disease in or came in for routine preventive medicine for perceived diseases that were going to occur. So I felt it was my duty to become more educated as far as pigeon disease was concerned. As a veterinary student, I was taught nothing about racing pigeons. So I came out of college with no knowledge about racing pigeons, and I have been consequently having to learn it since. I did a lot of research into the written word about racing pigeon disease, and I talked to a lot of owners about racing pigeon disease, and consequently got familiar with the problems. And because I was in a mixed general practice, which had access to a wide variety of licensed animal products, including pig products, chicken products, poultry products, I felt able to satisfy the demand for racing pigeon products.
That's fine. And tell me, what are the practical difficulties from a veterinary's point of view regarding racing pigeons?
Well, apart from the practical problem of not knowing anything about racing pigeons to start with, there was a dearth of informed information about racing pigeon disease. So this took a bit of rooting out and finding. There was also lack of interest by the rest of my profession regarding racing pigeon disease. So it was very difficult to become informed about disease.
Obviously, you're a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, and you have disciplines to adhere to. What are the legal requirements as far as prescribing the medicines are, David?
Well, all animal medicines are controlled by the Medicines Act 1968. This means that they all have to have a license before we can use them in animals. Now, this license varies from what's known as a prescription-only medicine, or POM product, to a PML product, which is a pharmacist and merchant's list product, or a P product, which is a pharmacist's only product. Now, all antibiotics are a POM product, and because they are a prescription-only product, they can only be dispensed or prescribed by a veterinary surgeon. And before a veterinary surgeon can prescribe them, he is obliged to have the animal or bird under his care. Now, this under his care is a very important term. It is not legally defined, but it is regarded as you have to have the animal immediately prior to prescription under your care, or examined and under your care. Now, if an animal is not under your care, the veterinary surgeon is not legally able to prescribe a POM product. Now, the PML products, for instance, are available from farm merchants, and they can be prescribed or given by the farm merchant for use in an animal that is involved in the licensing of that product. Now, with pigeons, we have a problem in that not many products are licensed for use in pigeons. This means that a PML product, which might be effective in pigeons, is not licensed for use in pigeons. Now, it is also a legal specification that only a veterinary surgeon can prescribe a licensed product for a species that is not included in that license. So I, as a veterinary surgeon, can prescribe a PML product that's licensed for use in pigs or cattle or horses, but not in pigeons. But I can prescribe it in pigeons because I'm a veterinary surgeon.
Seems like a minefield to me, David. You've written a book, I understand.
Yes. I've written a book about pigeon disease, and I've then written a book which perhaps explains this minefield a little bit better, about pigeon treatment.
In this book, I can imagine a scenario of people phoning you up and asking you for example, Tylon for a respiratory infection. But because it's a POM product, you cannot do it on the phone. You must have this pigeon under your care being visually examined.
Correct, yes. I frequently do get people ringing me up and say, send me some Tylon. I am not legally able to do that.
And the penalty, if you are caught, of course?
It's quite severe. I mean, I could be fined £2,000 or imprisoned for 2 years for breaking that Medicines Act 1968. If I then was found guilty of breaking the Medicines Act, the governing body of the veterinary profession, which is the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, may consider me guilty of disgraceful professional misconduct. And if they do that, I would be struck off, which means I would lose my livelihood as a veterinary surgeon.
Yes, I can understand and indeed sympathise with the problem. But why is it, when I go to Belgium, I can buy virtually any antibiotic I like from almost any outlet in Belgium, Holland and so on? Why is that?
Well, Belgium is in the European Economic Community, as is this country. And they have the same rules and regulations, but they don't adhere to them the same way as British veterinary surgeons do. Now, this is a situation which causes frustration to British veterinary surgeons. It as you say, it is not uncommon for fanciers to come to me and say, well, I got this by post, I got that by post, I popped into a veterinary surgeon's in Belgium and got it. This should not be occurring if we're all adhering to the same rules and regulations, but it is. And the adherence to the rules and regulations regarding animal medicaments is just one example of the difference in priority that different countries will put on adhering to legislation.
So tell me, how are we going to encourage pigeon fanciers to come along to their local veterinary?
Well, I think we've got to first of all encourage veterinary surgeons to be more willing, able to treat pigeons. Now, this might involve better education at the veterinary college, or it might indicate better education once they get out of college. Now, veterinary surgeons in college are taught about rabbits, guinea pigs, goldfish, budgerigars, and all sorts of exotic species. I'm sure you will agree with me to say that there are many more pigeons in this country than budgerigars.
Value-wise, of course, we are talking a lot more money as well.
Yes. Value-wise is perhaps not a case we ought to be discussing, but yes, there is a lot of value in pigeons. They come somewhere between a pet and a commercial enterprise, but they certainly should be regarded high on the list of priorities in the veterinary profession. If we can become better educated, and pigeon owners perceive the veterinary surgeon as the source of knowledge regarding pigeon disease, then we ought to be able to supply a wider range of more effective products.
Let us now talk about the disease in pigeons, the prevention, the treatment, and so on, once they've been identified. From our earlier conversation, I understand there's not too many problems with pigeon diseases. What are the common problems, in your mind, the basic problems of pigeon disease? What are they?
Well, there are 4 common basic diseases in pigeons. They are coccidiosis, canker, worms, and respiratory disease. Now, it has been found that all pigeons carry these organisms to a certain extent. So all pigeons have a potential for having disease, and this potential occurs when the stress factors allow these organisms to flare up and cause the disease. And the stress factors might include overcrowding, poor husbandry, stress of molting, racing, breeding, water deprivation. So under these conditions of stress, the disease organisms flare up and cause disease. And it is for this reason that preventative medicine is recommended. That's timed medication throughout the year to keep these organisms under control, as well, of course, as reducing these stress factors.
So really, we've got a virtual time bomb here.
Absolutely, yes. Every pigeon has a potential to have these organisms at bay, kept under control by the natural immunity of the pigeon, and this can flare up under the correct circumstances, those of stress, which I just mentioned.
Is it possible to exist without drugs?
Well, if we keep the stress factors to an absolute minimum, then the need for drugs will be consequently reduced. Now, these stress factors include breeding, racing, overcrowding, poor feeding, lack of fitness, and of course, if we can reduce these, we reduce the chances of disease. But I would suggest that the life of a racing pigeon is likely to occasion these stress factors. So we can't reduce the likelihood of disease entirely. So the routine medication is still necessary.
In that routine medication, disinfectants are very important.
Yes, disinfectants are designed to kill germs. and the use of a disinfectant is perhaps very important. Now, germs exist in warm, damp environments, so if we keep the loft dry, they shouldn't have a disease risk. Now, a deep litter, which is dry, is not a disease risk. A shallow litter, which is damp and warm, is a disease risk. So the ideal situation is to keep the loft dry and free of germs, either by very thorough scraping or by very thorough scraping plus disinfectant.
So how often do we disinfect the loft?
Well, this will depend on many factors. How many pigeons you've got in the place, how dirty the place is, but mainly how damp it is. Now, it also depends on how much time you've got and how you feel like willing to get round to doing the disinfectant. Some people disinfect 3 times a week. Other people will never disinfect. But the main thing to remember is that a dry loft is not necessarily an infected loft or a dirty loft. So dryness is the important thing.
Right, I can understand that. Diseases. Let's get back to basics. Coccidiosis. The prevention, the cure, and you tell me, coccidiosis.
Well, coccidiosis is quite a straightforward disease. It causes listlessness, loss of weight, and death, predominantly in young pigeons. There is an age immunity that develops with the age of the bird, so the older birds are not as likely to get the severe disease. It used to be, or still is, frequently referred to as going light. But going light is a symptom of going light or losing weight, and it is seen in many other diseases as well, so shouldn't be confined to coccidiosis. Now, it's caused by a little protozoan parasite which invades the gut wall and therefore destroys the absorptive capacity of the gut, and therefore causes diarrhea and inability to use the food that the bird eats. Therefore the bird has diarrhea and wastes away, or goes light. This little protozoan will invade the gut wall, multiply and produce loads of eggs, which are then passed out in the droppings of the bird onto the floor, and they survive in the damp conditions found on the floor. Another bird will come along and eat this infective ovum and become infected and go down with the disease. These ova can be seen quite clearly in a swab of the guts of the muck of the bird under the microscope, and they can be counted. And depending on the level of infection, the disease can be assessed as severe or moderate. But it's quite an easy job to count the number of coccidial oocysts in the droppings. It's done by taking a swab and looking under the microscope and counting. And the little eggs have a distinctive appearance when compared to worm eggs, which look different. Now, the prevention of coccidiosis, of course, is to keep the floors dry, or to prevent other birds eating droppings of infected birds. And the most effective way is to keep the loft clean, or to provide slatted floors so the droppings fall through out of reach of the pigeons. The coccidial oocyst can be found in all birds. All pigeons have coccidia. Now, some people think that a low level of coccidia is a good idea because it stimulates immunity, and they like this. Other people will think that any level of coccidial infection wants preventing, because any damage to the guts prevents the bird functioning as a fit bird. So the routine preventive medicine is used, and this will involve medicating effectively twice a year to get rid of the coccidia.
There's several treatments for coccidiosis. What is your preferred one?
You're quite right. There are several treatments involving garlic, coxoid, apotex. I prefer to use sulfadimidine, which is unlicensed for use in pigeons, but has a wide use in other species against coccidiosis. So I know it works in other species for coccidiosis, so I use it in pigeons. That's the drug that used to be called sulfamezethine, made by ICI, but has been now withdrawn, and the active ingredient is sulfadimidine, but it's still made by various manufacturers and is still available to me.
So we're saying sulfadimidine is the same as sulfamezethine.
Yes, the active ingredient of sulfamezethine was or is sulfadimidine. So any product that has sulfadimidine in is effectively the same as sulfamezethine.
Now, why do you use sulfadimidine? Is there a good reason why you use it, apart from what you just told me?
No, I have access to it, and I know it works in other species against coccidiosis, and I know it works very well in pigeons. I found it economical, very easy to use in that you put it into the drinking water of the pigeon. It is my treatment of choice.
You're quite happy?
I'm quite happy with it, yes.
So tell me, how do you use this sulfadimidine?
Well, sulfadimidine is a liquid that's sensitive to light, so it's always stored in dark cupboards, in brown bottles if possible. And I use it in the drinking water of the pigeons at a dose rate which ensures that if a pigeon drinks a normal amount of water in a day, which is between 25 and 50 mils, it will eat or drink a therapeutic level of sulfadimidine. Now, I use it differently for birds with disease than birds that need preventive treatment. If they've got coccidiosis, I use it for 3 days, then 3 days on fresh water, then 3 days on medicated water again. And I use it at the level of a tablespoonful to each gallon of drinking water. Now, if I'm using it as a preventive medicine, I use it for 5 days at a tablespoonful to a gallon of water.
We've talked about coccidiosis. What about canker?
Well, canker is a very similar disease to coccidiosis in that it's caused by a protozoan parasite, not a virus, not a bacteria. The difference is that it's spread in the throat of the pigeon via the crop milk rather than in the droppings like coccidiosis is. But the similarity is also that it's a disease of young pigeons. Obviously, young pigeons receive the crop milk, and it is the young pigeons that get the disease. It is also present in every pigeon. They have found it in every pigeon that they've tested, and they have assumed that every pigeon is a carrier of canker organisms. So it is equally important to treat them preventatively to prevent the upsurge of organisms under stress.
But how do we diagnose it?
It's very easy to diagnose. You can take a dampened cotton bud and swab the back of the pigeon's throat to pick up the organisms, and then transfer that dampened swab and rub it on a glass slide and look under the microscope. And you look for these mobile protozoan parasites.
So how do we prevent canker?
Well, quite easily by preventive treatment. Unlike coccidiosis, canker is spread in the crop milk. So it's much more important to medicate the adult birds than it is to keep the floor clean, because the organism is spread from the infected adult bird to the squeakers in the nest that are receiving the crop milk. So let's treat the incubating birds, the birds that are sitting on the eggs, before they produce the crop milk. And if we assume that every bird carries the canker organism, it is important to medicate the whole loft rather than just individual birds.
What preferred treatment do you use or recommend?
Well, again, there's a wide variety of treatments on the market, but as a veterinary surgeon, I have experience and knowledge about the use of dimetronidazole or Emtril in animals with hexameter, turkeys for instance, and other animals with canker. And I prefer to use Emtril. It's a soluble powder which mixes in the water to the rate of a teaspoonful to a gallon. And it's very specific for canker and usually, in my experience, very effective.
And full-blown canker?
Just the same, I treat them with Emtril quite effectively.
Let's talk about worms, David.
Yeah. There have been many different species of internal parasites identified worldwide in pigeons, but in this country we only really need to worry about two sorts. That's ascarids and hairworms. Now, it is safe to assume that all pigeons have some degree of worm burden. And to my way of thinking, any degree of worm burden deprives the pigeon of both nutrients that are better used by the pigeon for health and vitality, and they also irritate the guts, which is not a good idea in pigeons. So worms occur in all pigeons and are better eliminated.
So how do we treat worms?
Well, we just use a routine worming medication twice a year, and there are many routine wormers on the market.
I understand there's a new one which is used for horses.
Yes, that's correct. It's a horse wormer that vets have used on pigeons because they find it very safe. The drug is called ivermectin, and it's in a product called Ecfalan. Now, ivermectin is licensed for use in many species: goats, cattle, sheep, pigs, but not pigeons. Therefore, if a vet feels that ivermectin is the drug of choice, he is using it off license. And only a vet can use a product off license. So a pigeon owner should only be able to get Ecfalan from his veterinary surgeon.
We discussed that, of course, earlier on. Tell me, how do we prevent worms?
Well, worms are picked up in droppings again. Worms that live in the pigeon's droppings, in the pigeon's guts, beg your pardon, produce eggs, which get into the droppings, and another pigeon eats those droppings and becomes infected. It is important to realise that these droppings, or these eggs in the droppings, need a certain time to mature before they become infected. So these droppings have to be lying around for a while. So anybody that's clearing away droppings regularly stands a very small chance of worms spreading from pigeon to pigeon. Wild birds also are a source of worms. So if pigeons fly out and land at watering holes where wild birds drink, they could also pick up worms in that way. So worms are easily spread, and the worm eggs survive, as do coccidial oocysts, more readily in damp environment.
This horsewormer, which is becoming very popular for treatment of worms in pigeons, how do we use it?
Well, the Ecfalan horsewormer is in a syringe, and it's designed to go into the back of a horse's mouth. There's about 6 inches of paste inside a syringe, and you open the horse's mouth and squirt it on the back of its tongue. Now, when I use it in pigeons, I use it at a rate of about 2 inches of paste dissolved in 4 pints of water. Now that is enough to medicate 75 pigeons. So obviously I'm using it at a much stronger dose rate in pigeons per kilogram than I am in horses. But it has such a wide safety margin that this doesn't seem to occasion any trouble at all. So I squirt 2 inches into 4 pints of water, mix it well in, and give the birds this 4 pints to drink.